今天还是2025年9月7号，我想继续来看一下这本 China Economy 的书啊，因为没什么事。今天想分享的这一章是讲这个2008年金融危机对中国经济的一个影响。实际上，作为经历过这场金融危机的时候，那时候在上高中吧。因为父母都是大学老师，所以说并没有什么特别的那种感觉。但实际上，08年的金融危机对中国经济的影响，从宏观方面来看起还是很大的，就相当于这是一个 knowledge feeling 吧。讲07年的，就是上面这一段很有意思啊。讲07年的温家宝的这个政府工作报告是非常明确的指出，中国的经济发展是不平衡的，也不稳定，而且是不可持续的嘛。它其实主要就是指中国的经济是对这个investment 和这个出口实在是就是太 rely on 这个出口和这个投资，而且内需一直增长的比较慢，但实际这个差距呢是在金融危机之后更加加剧了，所以我们可以来看一看08年金融危机对这个中国经济的影响。The global financial crisis that began in September 2008 had a profound impact on China, despite the fact that its own closed financial system was not directly affected. The main effect came through exports. As trade finance dried up and the global economy weakened, demand for Chinese exports plummeted by 20% over the next year, by far the biggest annual fall in export value in Chinese history. The impact on employment was swift. An estimated 23 million workers in export-oriented factories were laid off by the Lunar New Year holiday in February 2009 and told not to come back to work after the vacation. In response, China unleashed an infrastructure-focused economic stimulus program with a headline value of RMB 4 trillion， 就是那个4万亿刺激计划啊，温家宝弄的。那实际上是 12% of the GDP， 那相当大。Over the next 2 years, the actual stimulus was probably closer to RMB 11 trillion. At a time when every government in the world was launching stimulus programs, China's was the biggest, both relative to the size of its economy and in absolute terms. 其实这点还是挺有意思的，就是那时候我感觉邓小平往后的几代领导人都还是很关心民生的。那底下也说了 ，The announced immediate objective of the stimulus program was to maintain an economic growth rate of at least 8%. The rate Chinese leaders believed was necessary to ensure satisfactory employment growth. In this they were successful. GDP growth averaged over 9.5% a year in 2009 and 2011. 就说那时候他们认为这个经济增长是必须要保持的，如果不保持的话，政权就会不稳定。但somehow当今的市场是没有这个，就是没有这个，就是他会花更多的这个精力在维稳上，而不是说去促进经济发展。At a deeper level, the stimulus program and a variety of subsequent policy measures reflected a shift of course in economic strategy. The leadership realized that China's unusually large export sector, with exports equal to 35% of GDP, triple the figure for Japan, and a current account surplus of 10% of GDP, by far the largest of any major economy, was more of a vulnerability than a strength. The problem with relying so much on exports is that if your trading partners run into trouble, so do you. Chinese policymakers decided that future economic growth would have to come mainly from domestic demand, not exports. In this, they were also successful. The current account surplus fell from 10% in 2007 to 2% by 2013。所以十几年前的时候就已经领导人就是知道这个外向型经济是很 risky 的，但是时至今日好像并没能改变什么吧。Domestic demand, of course, has two main components: investment spending and household consumption. In the short run, it was unrealistic to expect Chinese consumers to suddenly start spending a lot more money, especially since many of them had lost their jobs in the export slowdown. And in general, changes in consumption patterns tend to occur very slowly. So to stimulate domestic demand, the leaders did the only thing they could: push up investment through government spending on infrastructure and private spending on housing. As a result, investment surged from 41% of GDP in 2008 to an astonishing 46% of GDP in 2010, a level it roughly maintained for the next 4 years. In other words, China reduced its external imbalance, the trade surplus, by increasing its domestic imbalance, the high investment rate. Another consequence of the global crisis was that it prompted a decision to make the renminbi an international currency, rather than a purely domestic one. Okay. The basic reasons that policymakers decided to push on this front were: A, they believed the global crisis was caused in part by the U.S. government's abuse of the dollar's position as a main global currency, and B, they worried that over-reliance on the dollar for trade invoicing made China vulnerable. At times, as in late 2008, when dollar-denominated trade finance dried up. 所以这个人民币国际化也是在温家宝时期就提出的。所以很多其实中美之间关系不好或者爆雷的原因，其实不全是习近平的锅啊。Why is the return on capital falling? The stimulus program got China past the global crisis in better shape than any other major economy, but the artificial boost it gave to the economy papered over the fundamental structural challenge. The mobilization phase of growth was at the end of its natural lifespan, and important reforms were needed to ensure that the efficiency phase of growth could begin. The last 3 years of the Hu Jintao administration, 2010 to 2012, saw very few concrete structural reform achievements. This failure seems to have stemmed less from an inability to diagnose the problems than from an incapacity to enforce solutions. The 12th five-year plan for 2011 to 2015 contains a number of targets showing an understanding that many of the traditional growth sources were exhausted and that new ones needed to be cultivated. In particular, the plan expressed the intent to increase consumption's share in the economy and to promote that aim by ensuring that a higher proportion of national income flowed to households. who are likely to spend their income, rather than corporations or the government, which mainly invest. But the authorities did not come up with specific policies to realize these goals. Unable to attack the economy's structural problem, but fearful of letting GDP growth slip, the government instead tolerated a huge buildup of debt by local governments and corporations, mainly to fund investment projects that propped up reported growth while the money was being spent, but whose returns and hence contribution to future growth were quite low. Virtually every indicator of investment efficiency shows a severe deterioration in the 5 years after the global financial crisis. According to a recent report by OECD, the average return on capital, which rose from 10% to spectacular 17% between 2000 and 2006, had fallen to 9% by 2014. The incremental capital output ratio, which measures how many dollars of new investment are required to create a dollar of GDP growth, was fairly steady at between 3 and 4 for virtually all of the reform period up through 2007. It began to climb after the global crisis and by 2013 exceeded 5 for the first time. Perhaps most telling, the contribution to growth from productivity began to shrivel. The OECD found that between 2000 and 2007, economic growth came about equally from capital accumulation and productivity. This accords with the story we just told that China's growth in the first 3 decades of the reform era came in roughly equal parts from the state's ability to marshal capital resources and from productivity gains achieved by gradually moving more and more of the economy into private hands. But in the years 2008 and 2012, the OECD found that about 3/4 of growth on average came from capital accumulation and a quarter or less from productivity growth. By 2012, productivity contributed only about 1/6 of GDP growth. This deterioration can be explained in part by the corporate sector dynamics we described back in Chapter 5. Returns in state-owned companies fell sharply after 2008. But despite their poor performance, SOEs maintains an unreasonably large share of the economy thanks to their political connections. 这个国企改革自朱镕基之后就不太彻底了呀，没有办法触动利益了。Measures of the productivity of capital are necessarily rather technical. A clearer picture of China's productivity problem emerges from a single indicator, debt, or more precisely, the level of debt compared to the size of the economy. This debt-to-GDP ratio is commonly termed leverage. As figure 12.4 shows, the total borrowings of households, non-financial companies, and the government stayed roughly stable at a bit less than 140% of GDP for several years, until the financial crisis. After the crisis, the debt ratio surged by about 90% points in 5 years, reaching 230% of GDP in 2015. 哦哇，他没有跟美国比一下，就是这个债嘛，地方债务已经很可怕了。What this means is quite straightforward. Most debt is taken on to finance productive investments, so long as the return on those investments is reasonably high. Debt and GDP grow at about the same rate, and the ratio between the two remains stable. A rising debt to GDP ratio can mean one of two things. It could be that the financial system is becoming more sophisticated, enabling households and companies sustainably to take on more debt. This is what happened in the United States between 1960 and 2000, with the rise of credit cards, home equity loans, and other forms of consumer finance. Or it could be that people are taking on more and more debt to finance projects with a lower and lower return. While it is true that China's financial system has become more sophisticated in recent years, the evidence is strong that most of the extra debt incurred since 2008 was taken on by local governments and SOEs to finance low productivity projects. Obviously, this process cannot continue forever. At some point, the return on investment becomes so low that the debt cannot be repaid. At that point, one of two things can happen. There can be a financial crisis because many loans go into default, hurting the banks, or the economy can go into recession because even if special arrangements enable borrowers to avoid default, too much capital is tied up in projects delivering no economic benefit. 那现在来看是第二种情况啊 ，recession. Whatever indicator you choose, the conclusion is clear. China's economy has become much less productive and much more reliant on debt since 2008. This state of affairs derives in part from ineffective macroeconomic policy during the later years of the Hu Jintao administration, but more importantly, it reflects the central fact that we stressed at the beginning to this chapter. The days when China could grow at a fast pace in large part by accumulating capital, secure in the knowledge that the capital would almost automatically deliver high returns, are over. Policymakers must focus on fostering an economy where efficient use of resources rather than addition of new resource becomes the main source of growth, and the time to make that transition without first hitting a recession or financial crisis is fast running out. OK， 就读到这儿吧，拜拜。